The Vineyard Revolution, how 5 million vines redefined a nation's destiny. In the searing furnace of the Sahel, where the ground cracks and millet withers, one man stood before his people and declared war on the desert, not with tanks or treaties, but with vines. 5 million grapevines, not a single expert applauded. His cabinet looked stunned. Foreign donors scoffed. Grapes? Here? In a country where sorghum dies young and sand moves like an invading army? But Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not seeking applause. He was planting defiance. For decades, Burkina Faso had been written off as a drought-stricken state, its destiny defined by foreign aid, dependency, and loss. The world saw only dust. Traoré saw potential, and in one audacious order, he chose not only to halt desertification, but to reverse the very narrative of his nation. This was not about fruit. This was about freedom. Stay with us, not just for the harvest, but for the rebirth of a nation. Subscribe and be part of the story Africa was never supposed to write. They said it couldn't be done. They called it a fantasy. Wine in the desert, a phrase spat out with laughter in Western offices and muttered with doubt in Sahelian villages. But in the blazing frontier where the Sahara's sands devour grasslands grain by grain, Captain Ibrahim Traoré made an announcement that shook not only Burkina Faso, but the whole continent. He ordered the planting of 5 million grapevines, not along rivers, not in temperate valleys, but right at the throat of the desert. No one could understand. Grapes were the fruit of wealth, Mediterranean luxury, European vineyards, Parisian cafes, not something that belonged in the sun-cracked soil of a country losing arable land faster than it could measure. But Traoré, young, fiery, unbending, saw what others couldn't. For him, the vines were not crops. They were symbols. A wall of roots to halt desertification, a ladder out of economic despair, a banner of sovereignty flapping in the face of foreign doubt. The data was grim. Each year, Burkina Faso lost thousands of hectares to sand. Trees vanished. Fields turned to dust. Goats starved. Entire families migrated to cities already bursting at the seams. The desert, slow and silent, was winning. International aid agencies had tried and failed. They brought irrigation projects that broke down, imported seeds that wilted, endless capacity-building workshops that changed nothing. Meanwhile, the land died. If we cannot hold the desert, Traoré told his ministers, then we cannot hold our nation. That was the heart of the matter. This wasn't an agricultural crisis. It was a crisis of identity, and so Traoré crafted a solution that defied logic but captured imagination. He chose grapes. Why grapes? Because they were the opposite of Burkina Faso's image. Grapes evoked elegance, culture, and abundance. Wine spoke of Paris, Rome, Madrid, not Ouagadougou. But that was exactly the point. To Traoré, the vines were a statement. Burkina Faso would no longer be defined by what it lacked, but by what it dared to become. And behind the symbolism lay strategy. The ecological layer, grapevines with deep roots and leafy canopies, could stabilize soil and slow evaporation. If trellised properly and given modest irrigation, they could thrive even in semi-arid zones. The green belt would act as a living wall against the creeping sands. The nutritional layer. Grapes aren't just wine. They offer vitamins, antioxidants, sugars. For communities racked by hunger, a handful of raisins in the dry season could be the difference between strength and sickness. The economic layer. Global wine exports top $40 billion. Africa's slice is nearly invisible. Traoré saw a path not just to food security, but to international trade. If even a sliver of that market reached Burkina Faso, it could spark an economic revolution. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The logistics were colossal. 5 million vines meant millions of seedlings. Foreign journalists called it fantasy viticulture. Opposition parties accused Traoré of chasing illusions while villages went hungry. Aid agencies whispered concerns about unsustainable ambitions. But the captain pressed on. In a national address, he framed the project not as agriculture, but as resistance. The vine is not just a plant, he said. It is a wall against the desert. It is fruit for our children. It is wine for our markets. And it is dignity for our people. And then the orders were issued. From Ouagadougou to the remote borderlands, families began to move. Trenches were dug. Clay pots were buried for water. Seedlings were tied to sticks, not for food, not for fame, but for future. This was not farming. This was mobilization, a revolution by root and leaf. But vines alone cannot tame a desert unless they become more than plants. What happens when 5 million symbols start to grow in the sand? The planting had begun, but belief was still fragile. In villages across the Sahelian frontier, Burkina Faso farmers stared at the tiny vines with skepticism. Their hands dug the trenches, their backs bent to the task, but their hearts held doubt. Could these green threads truly hold back the desert? And yet Captain Ibrahim Traoré had planned for this. He knew belief doesn't come from words. It must be built seed by seed, step by step. He made sure the revolution was visible. He didn't send bureaucrats. He came himself. Wearing a simple tunic, Traoré stood in the dust, holding seedlings, tying vines to wood. State TV captured it all. Photos spread across the country, the captain of the nation planting grapes with farmers. The message was clear. This is not a government program. This is a national movement. And slowly the tide began to turn. The army, once trained to fight militants, now built trellises and repaired irrigation lines. They were dubbed the soldiers of soil. Youth brigades dressed in green marched with watering cans and shovels. Women's cooperatives, armed with knowledge from agronomists, nurtured nurseries in every province. The skepticism of the first days began to shift into something else, curiosity. And from curiosity bloomed pride. Children sang songs about the vines of hope. Artists painted murals of green walls rising against the desert. Market stalls were renamed Vine of the People and Raisin of Resistance. Radio stations played ballads praising the soil, the root, the fruit. But the desert did not retreat without a fight. Sandstorms swept through, burying rows of seedlings. Goats chewed through trellises. Irrigation kits cracked in the sun. More than half the vines died, yet something strange happened. The nation did not despair, because Captain Traoré had taught them to see differently. "We are not counting failures," he said. "We are counting survivors. Every vine that lives is a soldier standing." And then, in the middle of the second dry season, a miracle. Tiny clusters of green berries appeared. Small, fragile, but undeniable. Grapes, real grapes. In the Sahel, villagers gathered around them as if witnessing the impossible. Some touched the fruit with trembling fingers. Elders cried. Children laughed. Farmers stared in disbelief. Out of 5 million vines, perhaps a fraction had borne fruit. But the impact was explosive. This was not food. This was prophecy fulfilled. Captain Traoré seized the moment. He declared a national festival, the festival of the first harvest. In Ouagadougou, baskets of grapes were paraded like trophies. Musicians performed songs titled "The Desert That Gave Fruit" and "Wine of Sovereignty." Farmers wore wreaths of vine leaves. Even the military joined, not in uniform, but in celebration. And then, in a hall packed with farmers, women, youth, and foreign press, Traoré lifted a glass of deep red juice. Cameras clicked. Silence fell. The label read, "Vin du Sahel, product of Burkina Faso." "This," he said, raising the glass, "is not just wine. This is proof that we can turn sand into strength, despair into dignity, impossibility into sovereignty." The hall erupted. But it wasn't just a cheer, it was a roar, a release, a reclaiming. Images of the first grapes went viral. Diaspora communities in Paris and New York sent money to buy the fruit of revolution. Markets across Ghana, Togo, Côte d'Ivoire clamored for raisins. Even shops in Dubai placed inquiries. The world had doubted, but now it watched. And for the first time in decades, Burkina Faso was not asking for aid. It was offering a story of boldness, of vines that stood in the sand, of a people no longer defined by drought but by defiance. And as the grapes ripened, something else awakened. A continent watched and began to believe. But power, like wine, ferments, and not everyone wanted this vineyard revolution to succeed. The world could no longer look away. What had started as an audacious order from a young revolutionary had become a movement, a continental reimagining of what Africa could be. And with every image of green vines climbing wooden trellises against the desert sky, foreign observers were forced to reconsider their assumptions. Some did so grudgingly. Western development agencies, many of whom had dismissed the initiative as a populist stunt, began revising their reports. Phrases like emerging climate resilience strategy replaced earlier language of agricultural unsustainability. But the backpedaling was obvious. For Traoré, the reaction revealed everything. "They ignored us when we asked for tools," he said. "Now they chase us when we succeed without them." Behind closed doors, meetings were held in Washington, Paris, Brussels. Analysts worried. What if this model spreads? What if other nations begin rejecting foreign-led projects, choosing sovereignty over sponsorship? And indeed, the idea did spread. Mali began planting vineyards on its desert edge, calling them Traoré strips. Senegal integrated vines into its Great Green Wall initiative. Ghana offered technical support, seeing potential in West African wine trade. Even Morocco, a wine-producing powerhouse, sent agronomists, not to lead, but to learn from the Burkina model. Across the African continent, headlines changed. "No longer the starving Sahel," one Nigerian outlet declared. Now the Sahel that seeds itself. It wasn't just agriculture that was being rethought. It was development itself. For decades, the global North had dictated how the global South should farm, export, irrigate, and feed. Now, one of the world's poorest nations had bypassed the manuals and sparked an imagination revolt. The United States, notably, offered a lukewarm statement praising innovation in climate resilience. But behind that bland diplomacy, there was unease. Traoré had not only succeeded, he had done so without asking permission. Worse still, he had become a symbol. To youth across Africa, Traoré was no longer just the man behind the Ibrahim Traoré coup. He was the leader who dared to declare that wine could grow in sand and dignity could grow in drought. And just as grapes began to grow, so did the whispers of plots, of betrayals, of bullets in the dark. The land had bloomed, but now the man who planted it stood in the crosshairs. The vines had taken root, but the real test was just beginning. For Burkina Faso, the journey from planting to prosperity would not be measured in seasons. It would be measured in resolve. Every harvest brought new challenges. Droughts returned, pests adapted, and the global market proved as unforgiving as the desert wind. And yet something had already been won: the imagination. Captain Ibrahim Traoré understood this better than anyone. He often said, "We are not just farming, we are forecasting. Every vine is a vision." He wasn't planting only for Burkina Faso, he was planting for Africa. At the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, he stunned delegates by proposing a Pan-African vineyard corridor, a chain of green belts stretching from Senegal to Ethiopia, linking nations not by treaties, but by roots. The goal? Halt desertification together. Produce local wine, juice, and dried fruit. Foster tourism, education, and employment. Build resilience, not with handouts, but with harvests. His argument was elegant. If Europe united around coal and steel, why can't Africa unite around soil and sun? The proposal resonated. Niger and Chad pledged land. Ethiopia offered research collaboration. South Africa hinted at joining, contributing winemaking expertise. It was no longer about grapes. It was about continental coherence. Of course, the risks remained. Market saturation could undercut prices. Political instability might scare off buyers. Climate shifts could undo years of growth. But Traoré was not naive. He didn't promise perfection. He promised perseverance. And as vines climbed fences, so too did ambition. Local youth began launching vineyard tours for diaspora tourists. Fashion houses debuted fabrics printed with grape clusters. Radio stations aired shows titled Wine and Nation. One music group even released an album rooted in sand. And then came the whispers. The Ibrahim Traoré assassination attempt. Details remain murky. Official statements were vague. But something had happened. A convoy ambushed. A bullet missed. Or maybe it didn't. What is certain? The following morning, Traoré appeared on state television, calm, composed, wearing a wreath of vine leaves around his wrist. He said only this: "They tried to silence a farmer, but the roots are already in the ground." The message was unmistakable. Even if they killed the man, the movement would survive. And so the question lingers like the scent of grapes in the heat. Can Africa rewrite its story in vines, not violence? In sovereignty, not survival. The vineyard had been planted. Now came the reckoning. From the dust of doubt, a vineyard had risen. What began as an order to plant 5 million vines had become something no one, not even the boldest dreamers, had predicted. A revolution by root and ritual, a declaration written not on paper, but in the soil of the Sahel. Yes, the harvests were small. Yes, the vines were fragile. But they had done something that aid could not, that speeches could not, that even the gun could not. They had rewired belief. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once known only for the Ibrahim Traoré coup, had reshaped his legacy with green hands and unflinching vision. His gamble had not merely yielded grapes, it had awakened a people. From Ouagadougou to Bobo Dioulasso, farmers now spoke of pruning seasons and fermentation, not migration and misery. Schools taught viticulture alongside maths. Markets sold raisins wrapped in pride. Women's cooperatives no longer waited for NGO projects. They exported product stamped with identity. Even the assassination attempt, real or rumored, could not unearth the vines. Because something deeper had taken hold. The idea that Burkina Faso, long treated as peripheral, disposable, barren, was none of those things. It was fertile in courage, rich in resilience, capable of leading, not following. And now the world drinks its wine. Not for flavor, but for testimony. As Traoré stood once more before Parliament, he raised a glass of vin du Sahel and said, "We have planted not only vines, but dignity. We have bottled not only wine, but sovereignty. And we have shown the world that Africa's future is not written in sand, but in courage." The chamber erupted, and across the continent, people lifted their heads a little higher. If this story stirs something in you, don't let it fade. Like, share, and let the world hear. Africa is not waiting. It is already rising. Comment your truth. Africa, rise, vines of freedom, new Africa. But what's undeniable is what bloomed after. Let those who plotted the Ibrahim Traoré assassination attempt see what they could not kill. A nation flowering in defiance.